The ideas and information explored in this webinar are featured in Thinking Like a Lawyer, a framework for teaching critical thinking to all students, by Colin Seale, available from proofrock.com. So let me introduce our speaker today. Colin Seale is a former lawyer. He is, I made the mistake of introducing him as a former math teacher the last time we were talking, but with lockdown and Colin teaching at home, he's still a math teacher at home right now with his own kids. He is a nationally recognized speaker. He is the founder of Think Law, a professional learning company. And he is a contributor to Forbes, Edutopia, Education Post, and the 74. I'd like to welcome you, Colin. Welcome, Colin.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. I'm so excited that there's a lot of folks here that are familiar with that work, a lot of new people as well. And I cannot wait to dive into this really important and timely topic with you all today.
Me too. It is a really important topic, and I'm looking forward to visiting with you about it. But before we get into some of the equity questions and the racial justice questions, can we talk a little bit? I didn't do this the last time we did a webinar, and I thought it might be helpful if I could ask you, what is ThinkLaw, the company that you've created? What do you guys do? And because that's the bulk of your work, can you just tell the group a little bit about ThinkLaw?
I'm a math teacher. I'm a computer science graduate who became a math teacher and decided to like go to law school while teaching math at the same time, which I wouldn't recommend to most people. But as I started putting these two things together, the type of way that I was approaching the world as a lawyer and even as a law student, I went all the way back to my experience growing up in Brooklyn, New York, as one of few kids that looked like me, identified for a gifted and talented program at that time. And I felt like I was learning the same sort of critical thinking, practicing it and living it every day as a lawyer. And I never really put two and two together that this is the exact same construct that our kids needed in our classrooms. Didn't matter what the classroom was. So what we do is we have a curriculum that uses real life legal cases in upper grades and fairy tales and nursery rhymes in lower grades, since there's just so many shady characters in children's stories. And that curriculum is something that educators are using all over the country to make critical thinking a lot more practical for teachers. We also do a lot of teacher PD and parent workshops because at the end of the day, critical thinking cannot be a luxury good. If this pandemic has taught us anything, is that we need critical thinking now more than ever. And the equity challenges that we face for access to that type of instruction are as great as they have ever been. So, what we try to really focus on with the work we do with Think Law, which is really broken down in a book in very concrete ways, is we want to give educators tools they can use on a Tuesday morning in October to make that word equity not be a buzzword, but an actual strategy for instructional transformation across our school systems.
That makes a model. That makes perfect sense, and I'm glad that you've been so successful. I met you at a conference when you were there representing Think Law, and I know that that's something that I think the first time I met you, you had a crowd of people around you just wanting to talk about these issues, and I know that you're making a big impact in the world, and we appreciate it. Let me ask you to tell us a little bit about your personal background. You grew up. Your parents were immigrants. You grew up in Brooklyn, and your education experience. You weren't. You were a rascal at times.
Yeah. So, in a lot of ways, I was the kid that we all try to scratch our heads and figure out how to serve. Every single person here probably knows a kid who's unquestionably brilliant, but finds some way to do the dumbest stuff you ever heard of. If you don't know who that person is, you might actually be that person yourself. But that aside, when I start thinking about me growing up as a kid whose dad was incarcerated, who was on free and reduced lunch, and who had that kind of mouth, right, where I went above and beyond when it came to finding those digs and it just really struck me as interesting that when you look at the kind of behaviors that typically get associated with the poor behaving black male school to prison pipeline type of statistic, it's so interesting when you start realizing when I got put into my gifted and talented program, the same exact behavior went from being a punitive measure to a classroom requirement. So me questioning the teacher was no longer an act of willful defiance. Now it was mandated. It was part of what it meant to be inquisitive. Me going around and being out of my seat and talking to my peers wasn't me acting a fool. It was what was expected for this 21st century skill of collaboration. So when we start realizing that brilliance is distributed equally, but so often opportunity is not, then we've got to fight so hard to create those opportunities. Part of the work I'm doing with Think Law is to make it so that we can't reserve critical thinking just for these pockets. As much as this is a resource that schools in 30 different states are using for their gifted and talented programs, it can't be a luxury just for gifted kids, AP kids, or for honor students. Because if access to critical thinking is an honor, how are we ever going to see the transformational educational experience that all kids deserve?
Yeah, I remember you had a kid that you referenced in the book, Rommel, who I think his quote was, because this is, you know, this kid was from a poor background. His comment was, "Critical thinking is what teachers never let us do in school," and I think that you know, as a gifted education company, when we published your book, that was that was where we first got, you know, our foot forward was in the gifted education community. But the equity piece was very much part of the book as you wrote it and the examples that you gave, and as a result, then I think you've got a much growing broader audience in the general education market. Uh, talk a little bit about what is the framework. Can you describe
Sure.
the framework?
Sure. So one, I would say I'm not surprised that when Think Law debuted on Amazon, it was ranked number one in the new releases in gifted education and special education at the same exact time. Because the way that we're approaching this framework isn't something that is some sort of elitist sort of thing, either from the student perspective or a teacher perspective. Mind you, I started Think Law in Las Vegas, and that's significant because even in the best of times, Vegas had a teaching shortage. For a decade plus, Vegas has been dealing with a massive teaching shortage. So when I started Think Law, there were 600 long-term subs in the classroom. And my whole idea is this: if every kid needs to have access to critical thinking, this means every educator needs to be able to do it. This means we can't be talking about a pie in the sky sort of strategy. It's got to be something that's concrete. So what we've done with Think Law is we've taken essentially the best hits of what the thinking like a lawyer process involves. So when you're a lawyer, what do? You investigate, you negotiate, you undergo mistake analysis. And we've used these actual sorts of things you do in the law, and we transform them into a curriculum agnostic way for you as an educator to develop low floor, high ceiling constructs that allow you to take any piece of content and turn it into an experience where our kids can be at the center of their own learning and do a lot more heavy lifting. Okay. So, for instance, we can look at a problem around percent change. Okay. We do all these things around percent change in middle school math. But we could also look at the way that pharmaceutical companies do price gouging. We can look at the way that those young men who went and bought up all the hand sanitizer in their whole community and they try to sell it at crazy rates. Like we look at what they did from an aspect of percent change, and that angle of fairness and justice, it does something to you. So what we do in the Think Law book is we talk through a lot of these strategies, like looking at ranking fairy tale villains. Which one is the shadiest? I put my money on Goldilocks any day. I believe Goldilocks is the shadiest fairy tale character you can imagine. But imagine that as a discussion with kindergarten students. Because if we're honest, kids come out of the womb as critical thinkers. Our school system typically beats it out of them. So what Think Law is trying to do is we give you really practical frameworks so you can get there. And here's why this actually kind of connects to equity. I want to make sure I make this point. So often, I know, like so many of you right now in your school systems are dealing with this challenge of your school system board might have done a commitment to equity. They might have a Black Lives Matter like proclamation that has been made. Maybe they're sending people to diversity and implicit bias workshops, which is all great. It's all important. But what does it mean for me in a Tuesday morning in October? What does it mean for me when I'm teaching a virtual classroom with in-person students at the same exact time? And this is where we come in. We're trying through this book, through our work, through this whole mindset, recognize that we can't just design our instruction around what our kids need to do to be right. Where we get into the funk, where we get into those real critical thinking moments, is to actually ask them, what does it take to do right as well? Doing right is more important than being right. It's so important, it got its own t-shirt, right? So when you start looking at this idea around getting to the point of wrapping in social emotional learning, wrapping in what it takes for our kids to be able to think like a test maker so they can succeed on test prep, rekindling the way that they view their decision making. So we see their behavior changing, which is why we see Think Law being used at different in-school suspension programs and juvenile detention centers and kids aging out of foster care. We are trying to lay the foundation so that critical thinking no longer has to be a luxury good. And that's what the practicality of our framework provides.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Let me throw up one of the examples from your book. Um, this is sort of a model for how you would take a kid through the process of drawing conclusions and defending those conclusions. Can you talk a little bit about this model that's included in the book?
So when we look at this, and in Think Law, we kind of boil this down to a model that's called draw plus C. When you make a decision and you back up that decision with the rule, and then whatever that rule is, be that a scientific principle, a mathematical concept, an actual rule of law, a rule that you as the analyzer are making up and putting into this sort of situation, you start looking at arguments from both sides. When you look at both sides of the argument, you're going to also step back. You're going to ask that big picture consequential question of what would the world look like if? Which almost forces me to have a much more global analysis about what's going on. And then I'm going to draw my conclusion from that analysis. We have several things in the book where we lay scaffolds on top of that to make it even more accessible for kids. Because one thing that's not going to happen is your kids are not going to go from doing worksheets every single day to showing up in class and then being exposed to critical thinking and then rocking it out. That's not how this works. You need to teach the process just like anything else. So this draw plus C framework is used as a foundational aspect of what we look at because when our kids know what reasoning actually means, it changes the game. Many educators have a writing model that's like claim, evidence, and reasoning.
Mm.
Our kids more or less know what a claim is. They kind of know how to pick evidence. For reasoning, we never really talk through what that means. We say things like common sense and critical thinking, but we haven't really fleshed it out. But by having this draw plus C framework, it's almost like having training wheels. What are we trying to do? We're trying to develop that muscle memory so that anytime our kids are writing or thinking or arguing in any discipline, they can start to think through it and say, like, this is going to be my well thought out approach. It's not about the right answer, it's about the process that I get so I can figure out what to do in these things that are much more uncertain. And so much of what our education system is no longer preparing our kids for a black and white universe. They've got to be able to deal with that nuance and that gray. This is the framework for how to lead. This is the framework for how to innovate. And from a social justice standpoint, how is it that in one school over here, it could be nothing but spoon fed learning and rote memorization? And this school over here has a school where kids are learning how to innovate, how to lead, and how to break the things that need to be broken. One of those schools prepares you to lead the world. The other type of school prepares you at best to get a decent job with those other people. That's not equity. And that's what we're trying to really flesh out so that all kids can have access to that type of education that allows you to break the things that must be broken.
Yeah, okay. So that's fantastic. I'm glad you said that because it leads me into the sort of first critical question I had about equity. Let me circle back and say that all of this is in your book, Thinking Like a Lawyer, and all of these frameworks and processes. And what, as a teacher, I come from an education background. I was a teacher. When I was reading your book, I thought, oh, this is the kind of thing. This is a framework for how I can get kids to take a position, to gather evidence for that position, to look at other perspectives on the position that I have, and then be able to persuasively argue for that position, and also look at the ethics of the position that I'm taking as well. And it creates an environment where kids in any discipline are tasked with the job of rigorous thinking about a position that they're taking. And so everything that you do is leading up to that, kids thinking rigorously in the classroom. But I guess one of the first things I wanted to ask you about is, how is it that you see critical thinking as a pathway towards racial justice? What are your thoughts on how are those two things connected?
So this is where I kind of dive deep and like really kind of ask the people who are buying a book right now, or some people that might already have the book and have started to dig into it, or maybe you've already read it. I want you to think through it. I want you to think through this idea that I'm the child of an immigrant family. My mom is from Barbados. My mom came to the Brooklyn in the 70s. And when she moved here, she was brought up under this construct that she had to work twice as hard to get half as far. She raised me under a construct that said I have to work twice as hard to get half as far. I got a 5-year-old boy named Oliver. I got a 7-year-old girl named Rose. I don't want to tell them the same thing. I don't want to tell them the same thing. What does that mean? It means that at a certain point, we can't just look at academic success alone as the pathway to educational equity. Part of the work that we're leading through a program that we have that's called the Educational Equity Equation, which is a thing where people are getting the book, but then they're getting different PD and curriculum on top of the book. So when I look at the educational equity equation, part of what I look at is that racial justice requires more. It requires more than just academic success. So when I look at what it requires, I say it also means racial justice. What does that mean? It means that we can't just settle for teaching kids like me how to navigate the system. Okay. That's where I used to stop all the time. Like, well, if we just teach you how to get what you need to do, do a good job on standardized exams, get into a good college, have a good GPA, and then go out there and do what you got to do, then I'm like, all right, but where does that really leave us? It can't just be navigating the system. They need to know how to question the system. They need to know how to dismantle the system. They need to know what it takes to build a new one. In other words, it's not just playing the game, it's slaying the game. What does slaying the game look like? Slaying the game looks like a whole different model. Slaying the game looks like a model where we need to build atmospheres where our kids can talk about things that matter. We know that a lot of educators, saw what happened this summer throughout the country with the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. There's this reckoning around racial injustice that's happening. So what do? You're reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, you're reading White Fragility, and you're starting the school year like, you know what I want to do? I want to talk to kids about race. I got it. I see where you're at with that. But how are you going to talk about kids when it comes to race when you can't even talk about milk? So we have like this whole example. We look at like milk. If you're an almond farmer, milk means something very different than if you're a dairy farmer. And if we can get our kids to understand arguments and counter arguments and how to argue and counter argue depending on which side of this you're on, get to the point where you can actually see where the other side is coming from, start to empathize with their various struggles. We can start even earlier. We can look at Three Blind Mice in kindergarten. But instead of just looking at Three Blind Mice neutrally, it's like, well, wait a minute. What is it like to be a blind mouse? What are those hardships, those challenges, those struggles? What might explain why they're running after this farmer's wife to begin with? Maybe she smells like cheese. Maybe it's not about you, lady. And if we can start to build those nuggets of that empathy, that kind of communication style, that framework where we're listening to understand and speaking to be understood and learning how to disagree without being disagreeable, now we can start talking about things that matter. Now we can start having a space where kids are able to express their wants and desires, understanding that difference adds value. That's how we make equity much more actionable in a very real way in the classroom. And not for nothing, when we stop saying things like these kids are too low for critical thinking, these kids don't speak English well enough for critical thinking, these kids are too bad for critical thinking, and we start realizing that all of those things are actually assets, not deficits. When it comes to being a stronger critical thinker, it revolutionizes the way that teachers perceive what kids are capable of. And if teachers can believe that all kids can do this, well, that's like most of the battle right there. And the rest of it is the how. And we try to make that explicit as possible through a framework that's grounded in social justice, conflict, and drama. And show me a classroom today that does not see a lot of fire and enthusiasm around issues of justice, conflict, and drama. It's literally what it means to be a kid in 2020. So that's kind of how we try to make equity much more practical through that sort of a framework.
Yeah, one of the things that I loved about your model is that, and to say to use this word doesn't give it justice, but I'm going to say it's an adversarial model where quite often a kid takes a position and another child challenges that position, and they do it with evidence, and they do it, they question not only the facts but the ethics and the process, so that you come to a resolution together. So it's a way of arguing in a productive way. And if you and I guess what you're saying is, if you can start with questions of, like, if there's a debate between almond farmers and milk producers from cows, what the definition of milk is, and you can have that discussion. Those are the baby discussions before we get to some of these larger, more in-depth questions. But by having your framework, we have a vehicle to get there. Is that it? Am I capturing what you're saying correctly?
Yeah, yeah. And what I like about this too is it captures the imagination of different types of kids that typically experience academic success. So I can tell you something. I'm going to give you an advance warning. For those of you who are classroom educators or administrators that are looking to adopt something like Think Law, doing a book study around thinking like a lawyer or anything with this, I'm going to warn you of something. Your traditional high achievers, your high flying straight A kids, they're going to struggle with this model. I'm telling you, they're going to struggle with the model because they're so used to things being black or white. They're so used to these things being so concrete that they're not used to all this funk. Once you start talking about this funk, it changes things. It changes things. So when I start looking at um, myself as a child who was diagnosed or identified as gifted at 7 years old, but diagnosed with ADHD at 37 years old, struggling with ADHD symptoms throughout my whole life, right? Like, I'm at a space where I was younger, I would say these things or do these things that would get me in trouble and be really random. But like as I've gotten older, things have changed. As I've gotten older, a lot of what like my distractibility used to be a deficit, now it's helpful. Because a random thought that I come up with in the middle of a meeting that I go and tweet about ends up, going mini viral and gets all this attention to the work that we are doing because it's just a thought that I just thought up. Like I can't help it. But how do we create those spaces within our classrooms? I'll give you a very concrete example. I was once watching a classroom use a think law example, and I think I talk about this in a book where this was a girl who I knew. She was in seventh grade and she was on an IEP, okay, special education, in many ways just wired differently than a lot of kids in that classroom. They were having a conversation actually about a racial issue. It was a racial incident where, to preface the case, the teacher said, "What would be worse? If you threw a stick at somebody because they were Asian or because they had on a gray shirt?" And everyone was like, "Oh, that's messed up. If it's Asian, that's racist, and racism is bad, and people can't control what race they're born in." And she raised her hand and she said, "Gray shirt is much worse." And the class is all like, "Oh," but this teacher who was trained as a think law facilitator was like, "Well, hang on a second. We got to give her a chance to support it. So what's your support for that argument?" She said, "Well, look, we know that like racism is a real thing and there's racist people out there. But if you are throwing sticks at somebody because they have on gray shirts, you might have much more serious issues. Show me like a standard math volume that you just kind of pick off the shelf that allows kids to get that level of nuance in their thinking and add value in that way to that learning space. It likely does not exist. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create this funk. So even if it doesn't exist, you've got this book that gives you a set of tools that within 3 to 5 minutes of looking at your lesson plans, you can make these adjustments so that you can start to create those aha moments for those kids who are divergent thinkers and just look at the world differently. Because we deserve to have their magic unleashed as well.
Mm. Yeah, one powerful thing about even thinking about this webinar. And by the way, if you're interested in Colin's the whole framework and having a deep dive into that, we did a webinar back in April on that. You go back and look at our past webinar recordings and get a little bit more introduction to the nuts and bolts of his framework. But one of the things that I got thinking about when we were conceptualizing this webinar is that there are people out there who do education policy, and they set equity as a goal for the district or the state. They're politicians that work on this kind of thing. There are think tanks at universities that think about equity in education and coming out with policy statements and vehicles for getting there. But what you were excited about, and what I thought this is so so powerful is that the think law model and the critical thinking framework that you're talking about, that's a classroom level thing. That's something you just do every day in the classroom. You don't it's not part of it is part of a bigger picture, obviously, but it's something you can just do tomorrow and start training teachers into this or students into this kind of thinking. um, are you, I mean, you're aware of that this is actionable in the classroom tomorrow if you've got the training in it.
So let me kind of talk about this on a few different levels. When you think about decisions, how do we make decisions as organizations? Right? We have our mission, we got our vision, and we make our goals, and we just kind of go forth with these goals, and that's what we're going to do. One of the things that's interesting about the work we lead with Think Law is we help to kind of reimagine like what that looks like at all levels. Ultimately, our jam is the classroom. That is the one sort of untapped area for some reason that the equity conversations are not going. They're not going into actual teacher day-to-day practices. They're going to these internal things of like, let me make sure I'm recognizing my implicit bias. Let me make sure that I'm understanding like how to like select more diverse texts and diverse curricula. But the reality is, if you selected diverse text, but you still have all the power, you still are dictating what students are going to think versus giving them the tools and resources to understand how to think, you are limiting the power that they're going to be able to put out, not just into your classroom, but beyond that classroom. So, one of the reasons that I get really excited about a lot of folks that are interested in like, requesting a code for Think Law that are seeing this and like, oh, this is going to make our equity framework actionable. We've had this 4 point thing for years. Nobody really understands what those points mean in our classroom. We might know how to fix this policy around getting rid of out of school suspension or implementing a restorative justice program or whatever have you. But I don't know how much time we're spending really talking through what it looks like to go a little bit deeper and actually see on a concrete way what this looks like on a regular day-to-day basis that's sustainable. Because that's the other piece. A lot of times we understand where teachers are at. If y'all work with educators right now, can somebody buy them a donut? Can somebody get them a cup of coffee? Because like it's hard, which means they can't do one more thing. What they need is something that's going to help them do the one thing they're supposed to do in a lot smoother kind of way. When educators are using Think Law and they're seeing all these videos constantly popping up now, they're seeing people like much more engaged in these conversations. In the gifted and talented world, where for whatever reason it's not being prioritized right now, there's a lot of kids who are supposed to be getting a lot of gifted services right now that they're not getting. This idea of Think Law is this low floor, high ceiling construct where a lot of those emotional intensities are being gifted. A lot of that social justice orientation starts to be unleashed in a way that every kid is challenged at a level that they can push a little bit deeper with. So, I mean, practicality is what we're known for. Even if I'm keynoting a conference, I'm keynoting a conference, I'm keynoting a PD session at a district level with like, what are you going to do about it? Even my equity workshops, like, all right, what's within your power? And what are we going to do with that right now? Not next week, not after you get your PhD in anti-racism, but right now. And the cool thing about our products and these tools is they allow you to do that. They allow you to do that. I even give you language. I give you language to make the case for why this matters. Part one of this Think Law book is essentially a whole bunch of Bible verses. It's nothing but evangelism. It's straight up, I'm on a soapbox with a loudspeaker megaphone, and I'm shouting out the masses to get their act together and stop treating critical thinking like a luxury good. Stop saying things like street smart. Street smart is just smart. If we can't unleash that, that's an adult.
Colin froze a little bit there. So I tell you what I'll do is I had one section that I want to talk to Colin about online learning. But while Colin's unfreezing, let me ask you guys to bear with me, and I'll show you a few other little pieces of information here. Let me get you Colin's contact information. If you want to reach out to Colin with questions, if you'd like to communicate with him in other ways, please feel free use any of these contact methods, maybe just take a screenshot of Colin's contact information there, or write it down real quickly, and then well, I guess we have a little bit of time, so I'll leave it up there for just a little bit. Uh, Now let me come over here also, and please, I think Colin will hopefully be able to join back up with us in a sec. He's got the link to the webinar. So while we're waiting on him to get back in, let me ask you to put in some questions in the Q&A. I'm sure that there's a lot of perspectives that you have from the schools and the districts that you're working with right now that would be helpful to us as we further the conversation at the end of this webinar. And then also, let me remind you, I know this is a bit of a sales pitch here, but this is Colin's book, and we have it available at proofrock.com. It's available at Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, or anywhere you like to buy your books. We try to be everywhere, so feel free to pop over to proofrock.com and get a copy of the book. You can also see some inside pages and some samples, and you can also get that as an ebook or as a print book. So we've got it available in a lot of different methods. There's Colin.
Hey, I'm sorry
Back.
about that. What was
No,
happening
no.
is I was just spitting so much fire that they were like, "Yo, we need to like end the internet real quick," because I was about to kind of break
this
too many systems. There's going to be way too much equity for everyone to handle, so they had to just let me off for a little bit. But I'm
this
back,
this
and we're ready
this man is
to
full of
start the
dangerous
conversation.
ideas, I think. So, Colin, I tell you what, I think you're frozen again, Colin.
Oh, did we? Oh no,
Well,
I'm
the
here.
the
I'm
picture
here.
did, but okay, picture did, but the voice didn't. Hey, listen, let me do this because I did while you were out. I asked folks to post questions in the Q&A. I gave them your contact information for follow up after this webinar, and I also mentioned again the book that it's available from proofrock.com. And that was all leading up to this final question before we get to the Q&A questions. Can you talk a little? I mean, gee whiz, you and I are all classroom teachers at one point in our lives, and I, boy, my sympathy goes out to these teachers who are teaching online learning or blended learning classes, and uh, my kids have had such a fantastic experience with the work that my two little kids have the teachers have been wonderful, but I know it's been so much work on their part. Can you maybe talk about this online and blended learning piece that teachers are dealing with now as they're trying to grapple with also teaching critical thinking to kids?
Yeah. So this is something that's hitting home personally. My son started kindergarten in a virtual classroom. Just imagine that for a second. Just imagine like starting school virtually as a kindergarten student. And granted, it's the only thing he's ever knows, right? So he's fine with it and it's interesting and it works. But there's so many concrete things I hear every day between him and my daughter who's in third grade that I'm like, learning is a universal construct. Okay. I don't care if it's distance learning, in person learning, learning on your own, asynchronous, synchronous, who cares? It's all learning, is my bottom line. So I want any educator who's struggling with the moment right now, what I always ask to do, I always think about this for myself as someone who educates the educators. What needs to be done to maximize the learning? And if that's where my focus is, what I need to do is I need to have a recognition of when the learning moments occur. I'll give you an example. The other day, my son was in his kindergarten class, and I'm within the earshot, so I'm hearing this. And they were doing I words. So they're like, okay, kids, what's a word that starts with I? Because he was learning the letter I. And some kids said iguana. And then I'm like, man, I'm glad this is not a drinking game because I can't even think about an I word off the top of my head right now. And a bunch of kindergarten students were there looking. And then Oliver unmutes and he's like, lizard. And the teacher is like, oh, lizard. No, I'm sorry, Oliver. And she just goes on to other kids, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, lizard. There are so many different things that I would have done at that moment besides just moved on. If I was obsessed with learning, if it's in person, if it's virtual, if I'm obsessed with learning, then I need to think differently about mistakes. Mistakes are opportunities for me to dig deeper in the learning. So, iguana, and he said lizard. Why did you say lizard? Maybe because the lizard is like an iguana. Okay, great. I wasn't asking for you to tell me that, but at least you're able to make that connection. Because guess what? The ability to make connections like that in kindergarten is not something that does not matter. That's actually quite impressive. But here's what's even more interesting. If you are starting school in a distance learning environment and the font that you use is a certain kind of font, guess what? Your capital I and your lowercase l is the same exact character. It looks identical. So my son is saying lizard because he's seeing an I and he's thinking, well, lizard starts with the same letter. And I'm just thinking to myself, are we leaving genius on the table in any format? And how can we reimagine what we're doing so that we don't leave genius on the table? What we do with the think law construct, this thinking like a lawyer construct, is we are letting you get the maximum out of whatever you have. I don't care what your curriculum is. I don't care what reader material, what math volume you got. Using these strategies on top of what you already have is going to allow you to capture that sort of magical moment of learning that gets everyone a little more tuned in, that creates an environment where people are more open to take academic risks. So, yeah, great question.
Yeah, I'm still grappling with it. Like, how it that one-to-one experience that like what you're talking about in thinking like a lawyer, those frameworks and that sort of thing, there's a kind of a, a a dialogue that is happening between the teacher and the students that is allowing the kids to develop the kind of critical, rigorous thinking that you're aspiring to. When you're thinking about how would teachers do that in an online fashion, what is it how does it look in your mind, do you think?
So this is why I think it's so important. Like for those of you that are interested in kind of digging deeper, if you get the book and then you want to schedule a PD with me to actually look at this, in our PD relationships over everything, in all of our PD, we model exactly what it should look like. So what it is I'll tell you what it's not. It's not me sitting here talking to you for 30 minutes at a time. It's a lot of switching. It's a lot of polling. I mean, right before this, I was like, man, like I was kind of bummed that and I forgot this one before that the chat was disabled. Can I use the chat all the time? True or false questions are actually quite entertaining when you're in the midst of doing things live, right? My son, they're always doing jazz hands or they're doing whatever, or they're getting up in their seat, or there's all these different things you could do to make it more engaging and interesting. Polling, we start looking at the ways that kids can collaborate. Well, Padlet is a great resource for that. But we're not doing it for the sake of doing it. We're doing it to accelerate learning outcomes. You can do breakout groups in different platforms with relative ease. You can share documents and set up groups of kids to work in a shared document with relative ease. So we walk through these strategies in these workshops, but none of these matter if you can't teach critical thinking, if you don't understand what critical thinking is, if you don't understand how to do it, period. You need to know how to do it, period, before you can translate it into a different environment. But I would tell you this, the need for critical thinking is much more important because we can no longer hold our kids hostage.
Absolutely.
I'm
You
not
know,
trying
wh-
to berate teachers or downplay what the role is, right? But at the end of the day, I have a lot of power as a middle school teacher because my kids can't really go anywhere. If my kids put their head in the desk, I can just kind of walk gently and use my physical presence to get them to put their head up. You can't do nothing. If I'm staring at the screen right here, but I really have my phone down here and I'm just completely checked out, you got to find a way to check me in. Drama, conflict, ridiculousness. That's gonna reel me in. And if you could do that in a way that's not going to kill you, we're talking 3 to 5 minutes of pre work, then we can really start to make it as a sustainable pathway to use critical thinking as our roadmap for racial justice.
Colin, before Stephanie starts into the Q&A, I want to commend you on that because one of the things, as a teacher, a former teacher who was reading your book, I thought, oh, I wish I had this. The kids would have been really interested in this stuff. I mean, once they get into advocating for their positions or finding evidence to support their position or considering the ethical implications of the decisions that they're making, that's engaging. That was the kind of thing that diagramming sentences couldn't hold a candle to. It was that really good stuff. So I think that you're right. I mean, that's one of the critical pieces of the online part is an engaged kid, and your framework really does that. Now let me
Yeah.
let me turn this over to Stephanie here in the pause. Those of you who've written questions, thank you so much. We've got an active Q&A, and by the way, uh, y- Colin, your ADHD gives you the ability to look at the chat at the same time you're looking at the Q&A, and you're just fine doing that. I had to disable it because I can't look at both at the same time. But you're so once again you out skill me on that. But those of you who have written questions, thank you. Those of you who haven't yet, go in there and read the questions and upvote them. That helps Stephanie know which ones we'll be able to get to, because we only have about 12 minutes here, so for questions. So let me turn that over to Stephanie while we still have time for a good Q&A session.
Yeah, sure thing. Okay, so our first question is Colin's book enough to start a critical thinking program in my schools, or do I need more training? So, Colin, what would you suggest?
So I think that it depends on what you're trying to do. Okay. I'm trying to spark a critical thinking revolution. So I would say that the book is the jumping off point. I've had so many different educators this summer use Think Law as part of a book study. We have like our own kind of framework that you can purchase from us to kind of give you additional work to kind of think through how to dig deeper with the book's concept through a PLC, professional learning community sort of deal. And if you requested a quote, you can kind of get that resource from us. But even just informal style book study with a group of teachers, we've seen that translate to be like, okay, we've got this framework. Now I want to dig deeper. I want you to come and be the keynote for our PD conference at the back to school thing, or our October PD date, or you know, kind of dig deeper that way. Oh, I want to use your curriculum. I want to access your curriculum. So that's kind of a concrete way to start to push on that as well. To say the curriculum, it gives teachers the how right now. The teachers are overwhelmed, so we have our own videos as a resource in some of these curriculums. So even if like they can't do the lessons themselves because they don't have time, it could be an awesome enrichment opportunity for folks. So we've got those resources. We got parent workshops. Parents are dying to understand how to do critical thinking a little bit deeper. We've got a chapter devoted to this in the Thinking Like a Lawyer book. But like, if you want to go deeper on that, like we can help with that. So, um, and our stuff is so adaptable to virtual stuff. I probably worked with school systems in 30 states since March alone, doing virtual PD. So lots of opportunities to dig deeper, but this is enough to get that initial spark going for sure.
Great, that's helpful. So we have another question from someone who is leading equity training in her district. She says people are on board until it comes to really unpacking their own socialization and looking at the impact on their students. So going that extra step, what's the best way to get them there?
Sure. So one of the things that thinking like a lawyer is really good to do is it forces a certain level of honesty. We say a lot of things to make people feel nice in education because we're nice people. We're educators. Of course, we're going to be nice. So we like to use a word like implicit bias. And I wrote a blog post about this just a little while ago on a Think Law blog that we need to probably stop saying implicit bias when we really mean to say explicit bias. It's explicit bias when you're saying these kids can't. It's explicit bias when we see that there's certain types of behaviors or certain types of kids, or we meet their parents, and we carry those presumptions to mean that's going to set a ceiling for what those kids are capable of. What I like about Think Law is it makes it so that even if you don't believe, even if you're not a believer, you don't believe all kids can achieve, fine. Seeing is believing. Seeing is believing. You're going to get these easy tools and you're going to put them in front of your kids, period. If you put those in front of your kids, you start to realize, like, well, wait a minute. What just happened? How is it possible that my academically struggling learners are actually surprising me by how well they navigate this? Well, it turns out that learning how to learn is a 21st century strategy, and they're the experts at that. Why do my behavior kids become the rock stars? Because they're already thinking outside the box, because they already know how to think on their toes. And all of these things that tend to be demonized in the profession where, keep it real, there's a reason that teachers get lower insurance rates. We follow the rules. So by being able to push into this a little bit, giving you the framework so that kids can help break the things that need to be broken, it makes it so practically applicable to the classroom that your individual issues don't matter as much. We can't wait for everyone to become an anti-racist educator for our kids to get equity in the classroom. We don't have time for that. It's way too urgent. We need to give them tools right now. Right now. The same way we can't wait for a rookie educator to like know what they're doing and just waste their whole first year. We need to give them tools right now that allow them to have a effective level of success to make equity real for our children.
Great, that's helpful. Yeah. Our third question, are there any strategies specific to teaching critical thinking to English learners? Could you speak to
Yeah.
the challenges, advantages, and other factors?
So it's interesting. So if you're following like Think Law US on Twitter, following me on Twitter at Colin Seale, you'll notice me retweeting a lot of things, right? What's interesting about our ELL materials is that we don't have Think Law written in any other language but English right now. We have a Spanish one that's in development. But here in Arizona, in Mesa Public Schools, our sole partnership with the biggest district in the country is with a school that's using Think Law. In our state, is a district that's using it only for their ELL classroom. Why is that? Because it turns out that even in the ELL best practices, the best way to develop academic language fluency is through debate, engagement, things that kids actually want to talk about, things where they're going to be searching for the words because they want to say the thing that needs to be said. Okay, so when we start looking at like what this looks like in an ELL construct, let's be real. It's not a question of why can't we teach critical thinking to English learners. The real question is how are English learners already critical thinkers, and how do we tap into that? They're already thinking in two different languages, speaking in two different languages, looking at body language and shifting cultures. We can leverage that because they have unique perspectives on the world. Okay, so that's a big, big, big part of that one.
Great. All right. We had a question. Do you provide virtual professional development?
Yeah,
And also,
exclusively. Yeah, at
okay,
this
great.
point, it's exclusively. Yeah.
Okay, awesome, awesome. And then kind of attached to that, are you presenting at any conferences in the near future?
Um, I'm presenting at a lot of conferences in the near future. October is crazy. I'm the keynote speaker for Colorado State Gifted Conference, for Ohio State Gifted Conference, for Missouri State Gifted Conference. You know, God, there's just so many. I've almost lost track. So, if you look at like the work that we're doing, we're doing these equity education equation conversations every couple of weeks with different leaders in education to kind of have these conversations around gifted education, um, or about equity as a pathway to think about critical thinking as how we make racial justice real. We there's just so many different things that we do. So if you follow us on Twitter, I think this week I'm actually going to be moderating the GT chat, hashtag GT chat this Thursday. So if you just do hashtag GT chat and search for that, you'll kind of see the information about that. But like so many ways to kind of keep in touch and follow our work. I always encourage people like, you could also, if you're not an educator, if you're not in there, if you bought this shirt, go to our website. There's a link to actually just kind of get Think Law swag and different mugs with our models on it and stuff. Like this raises awareness for what we're trying to do. Like this is the kind of world we want to live in. I want to live in a world where our leaders understand that doing right is more important than being right. And this is a pathway to help get there.
Yeah, let me kind of hop in there, Colin. So for those of you who've asked a couple of questions about, how's the curriculum different than the book and that sort of thing. So Proofrock Press is a book publishing company, and we publish Colin's book, Thinking Like a Lawyer. Colin is an entrepreneur who has Think Law as his company, and they do professional learning all over the country. They develop curriculum. The Thinking Like a Lawyer book is sort of the primer for all of that other stuff. It's sort of the introductory piece that where you can start, read about the framework, read about the curriculum, the examples, and that sort of thing. But for the actual training that you might want to have from Colin, or for the actual Think Law curriculum, I'd refer you over to Colin's contact information, and just reach out to Colin, and they'd be happy to talk about the different services that they offer. Is that correct, Colin?
Yep. Yep. Definitely.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe Stephanie, maybe one more question.
Yeah, sure thing. What advice do you have for teachers who feel pressure to keep up with a certain schedule according to their district curriculum and feel that they may not have time to incorporate critical thinking?
So I can't buy that, right? Not for a second, because like for me, I don't know what you're doing if you're not doing critical thinking. Like my daughter is just learning the associative property in math. And I'm listening to her and I'm watching and following this conversation. I'm like, the associative property of math is one of my favorite properties. Why? Because, like, I've got like my friends, but then I got my associates. My friends, I got this really tight group. We never really change. But my associates, I switch them up all the time. And this idea of being able to make this connection to something that she experiences socially to see, oh, that's why the rule looks this way. That's why this rule is set up so that if you change the groupings of how numbers are being multiplied, it doesn't change the final product. It doesn't change the final sum because I know how to make a connection to the associative property. So I look at critical thinking as a pathway to make these connections at a high level. At the end of the day, what do we want our kids to be able to do? Solve an equation? Sure, that's great. Fix a mistake that I made in an equation? Better. Say, hey, Joel made a mistake and Colin made a mistake. Whose mistake is more right? Now we're talking. Now we're knee deep in this framework. Now we're creating a space where my joker kids, my kids who are all over the place, have a space. They have value. And everyone is getting challenged at a greater level. And more importantly, we're creating a much more equitable system that's not a tale of two cities, but actually a unified approach so that all kids have access to these tools that they need to break the things that need to be broken. Because honestly, I'm done with the adults. We are over with, our time is up. If our kids can't do it, we've got no hope. They're our only hope. So we have to make this a priority. Again, think about it within your existing framework. I'm not asking you to throw everything out the window. It's about how can you tweak things just so to create these moments for my kids to dig deeper? How can you listen to that mistake just a little bit deeper so you can change and shift the way that it gets resonated with the people that are experiencing it? And that is where we start to see the difference happen and see that transformation occur.
Yeah. Thank you, Colin. Well, let me wrap it up, folks. Thank you all for attending this. I know that you've got great deal of pressure on you with online learning and COVID and everything happening in the schools, and I know it's been stressful. The fact that you'd cut out a little time from your day to come in and hear Colin speak, I'm so grateful for that. Stephanie, thank you so much for coordinating the Q&A. But finally, Colin Seale, thank you for coming. Any last words, Colin?
Yeah. So honestly, for anyone that's looking to dig a little bit deeper, if you want to get like bulk purchases from us, or if you want to get more information about how to get our curriculum there, we do work really well with a lot of middle school advisories. We work for after school programs. We work with out of school sort of programming. There's so much that we do that like I almost don't want to limit the way you partner with us. So it starts by requesting a quote. We are our own organization, so we know how to do all the vendor paperwork and all of that. But I also want to say this: if you want to get in contact with me, if you just have a question, if you don't feel comfortable bringing up a question about a racial equity issue that you're facing, email me at colin@thinklaw.us. I want to be a resource to folks, and I want to make sure that you understand that like you're not alone in this process. We're all working really hard to do this work, and I want you all to be able to dig deeper. So I appreciate your time as well. And again, I'm just very grateful for Proofrock Press, Joel, Stephanie as a really amazing editor, to believe in the work that we're doing, and to see thousands and thousands of people buy this book, to see all these glowing reviews on Amazon. It's really been like the thrill of a lifetime. So I'm super, super grateful for everyone that's supporting what we're doing. And please, please, please do spread the word about it. Word of mouth is the number one reason that we're working with schools in 40 states. All the social media budget, all that stuff out the window. It's about word of mouth. So thank you for spreading the word and being a part of this movement.
All right. Thank you, Colin. And goodbye, everybody. We had such a good time.